Good evening. My name is Carla Hunter, and I am the Program Planning and Development Chair of the Eastern Panhandle Alumnae Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And on behalf of my chapter and the Contemporary American Theater Festival of Shepherd University, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual viewing of the documentary Pushout, the Criminalization of Black Girls in Education. This documentary takes a close look at the educational, judicial, and societal disparities facing Black girls. It confronts the ways in which the misunderstanding of Black girlhood has led to excessive punitive discipline in schools. At the conclusion of the film, there will be a panel discussion. Please stay and join us in this enlightening discussion. Thank you for your attendance. And now the award-winning documentary, Pushout.
My name is Kimberly Crockett, and I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Eastern Panhandle Alumnae Chapter. We are blessed to hear from a panel of experts in various fields who will discuss many of the themes highlighted in this very compelling film, Pushout, the Criminalization of Black Girls in School. It is my honor to introduce them. Dr. Chiquita Howard Bostic is our moderator. Dr. Howard Bostic is an Associate Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity at Shepherd University. Dr. Howard Bostic has championed such causes as anti-human trafficking, multicultural justice, dating, violence prevention, and financial and environmental sustainability. Dr. Howard Bostic earned a bachelor's degree in legal studies and a master's degree in urban planning at the State University of New York at Buffalo. She received a PhD in sociology from Virginia Tech. She is a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated Eastern Panhandle Alumnae Chapter. Terence Anthony. Mr. Anthony is a playwright, artist, and communications specialist based in Oakland, California. He has been awarded writing fellowships to distinguished artist programs, art institutes, and creative arts centers. Dr. Anthony's plays have garnered numerous awards, including 4 2017 Ovation Awards, finalist for the O'Neill National Playwrights Conference, and LA Weekly's award winner. His plays have been performed and developed throughout the United States at various festivals, playhouses, and theater conferences. Tiffany Burris is an assistant principal and gifted coordinator for Springfield Public Schools in Springfield, Illinois. She is a passionate advocate for equity in education and has devoted her career to making sure Black and Brown children are represented in programs such as gifted education, international baccalaureate, and advanced placement courses. Ms. Burns is the immediate past president for the Springfield Decatur Area Alumnae Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Theresa M. Davis is an artist educator in 3D, dramaturg, deviser, director. It is her steadfast desire to produce events that speak to diverse audiences in communities and academic institutions and beyond. Ms. Davis collaborated as a dramaturg with the Contemporary American Theater Festival's productions of The Ashes Under Gate City and Dead and Breathing. As a director, she has also enjoyed guest artist residencies at Macalester College and Purdue University. And finally, Dr. Gregg Suzanne Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson is currently an adjunct for the psychology department at West Virginia State University and is a member of Marshall University's Activist Archives. She is a certified counselor and teacher, as well as an educational and environmental activist who is sought after consultant for various nonprofit social service organizations. She is founder and executive director of Mothers of Diversity America. Dr. Ferguson earned a bachelor's in the history of art and architecture from Harvard University, and her master's in school counseling and education and leadership studies are from Marshall University. Welcome to our panelists, and I'll turn the discussion over to Dr. Howard Bostic.
Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging around for this wonderful panel discussion. What I wanted to do really quickly before we get started, there were a couple questions that were asked in the Q&A section, and I will provide just a quick response to some and then have the panelists step in and then chat around those. But as well, I would like for you to begin to introduce your questions into the chat that you have so that it will help us to facilitate this conversation. So one of the first questions that were asked is it okay to use the term Black? Or do I say African-American or Black? And in the chat, I said that African-American is an ethnic identity rather than race. So Black is race and Black is beautiful. And it is the politically correct concept that you would use other than colored people right now. So we want to transition away from that language and then move on to using these socially constructed terms that are subject to change. So we can understand the challenge in not understanding what language to use, because these are words that derive from our US Census and the variety of categories that have been identified every 10 years to understand the terminology that you use to identify ethnic groups and racial groups in the United States. Does anybody else have anything to add about the use of the terms Black or African-American and so on and so forth?
Oh, if I could hop in for a moment. Hello there. Thank you so much for that response. Also, when we're thinking about decolonizing language, the term Black is more inclusive. When we think about African-American, it separates us from other peoples of African descent. So as we think about this idea of decolonizing, that's why many of us are embracing the terminology Black.
Thank you, Theresa. Okay, and so the next question was about sharing ways that white administrators and counselors can build relationships with Black students. And one piece that I introduced in the chat was that with respect to counselors, we have to decide how much energy we want to put into each relationship. And that we also should think about how we interpret and respond to the words, experiences, and feelings of Black girls. So sometimes I wonder, are there really activities that are specific to Black students, or are all activities applicable to most children when we introduce and communicate about those activities in a relatable way? Is it the children or is it us? And so I wonder what the panelists think.
I will jump in with that one, Dr. Howard Bostic. And one of the things with, and even though I'm not a school counselor, I've done a lot of counseling with students. And in my previous roles, one of the things that I did was, I feel like you have to validate these young ladies, these Black girls, because they have a story. And oftentimes when they get to you, they have not been able to give their story. They've always been shut down and shut up. And so you have to validate them. You have to listen to them. And then you have to give them a voice. When I was in the classroom, I taught at a school called Capital College Preparatory Academy, and we were a gender-based class. So I had a group of girls. Every day they recited the poem by Aunt Marion Williamson, Our Deepest Fear. And they memorized it, they lived it, because it gave, and they talked about and journaled about what that poem meant to them, and so they could tell you what their deepest fear. And a lot of times it was, they couldn't be heard. So that's the road to start that, building that relationship. And one more thing I will say is you have to model. And when they're with you and they're not acting, as we can say, right, you have to show them the alternative. And I'm not going to say that their way of behaving was wrong, but we have to show them the alternatives and let them understand the difference. Where can this alternative get you versus that alternative? And giving them the opportunity to choose.
Does anyone else have any feedback to also add to that conversation?
Well, I can dovetail on that a bit. I think that it's important to also be involved with the community that you serve. so many times we have mentoring programs that come into the schools, and it's an hour spent a week. But the real problem happens with the teachers and the permanent administrations in the schools. And I would really advise any teacher, any administrator who's working in communities that they're not familiar with to go into the communities and go to those midget football games and interact with their families. There's such a disconnect between mothers and the teachers. They just start a lot of times from the same worlds, especially if you have white teachers who are educating Black students. And it is, I think it's pronounced when those teachers don't make an effort to reach across and bridge those gaps by being in the community and sitting with those families at midget league games, encouraging them to come to the teacher-parent conferences then and, meet them where they are. I started Mothers of Diversity to try to encourage, mothers and their daughters and their sons to have those dialogues with teachers and with people in authority, quote unquote, with whom they sometimes have adversarial relationships or with whom they're who intimidate them in many cases, so that mothers can explore their ACEs as well, and the things that they pass along, those kinds of attitudes that they may pass along to their daughters unconsciously and their sons unconsciously about their teachers, and definitely make teachers aware of their unconscious biases. Just like you should make any public servant aware of those unconscious biases. Take a Harvard implicit test. They're free, they're quasi-scientific, but they will give you a good impression of where your biases might lie before you unleash them onto unsuspecting children.
We might want to identify a link to that implicit biases test in our chat to help people who may want to explore that. So I wonder if we can find that and put that in there for people to take. It should be interesting for all of us, yes. Right? So also with this question, I acknowledged in the chat that cultural activities are historic and they're excellent, but that perhaps sometimes we need an accountability partner to help us understand if we're centering the positive and empowering histories. Does anybody have any feedback for any counselors or teachers who want to implement something, but perhaps they may be implementing the histories that are more negative, that in fact don't empower the faces and stories of our children, Black girls especially?
I didn't want to go ahead. Ms. Theresa,
oh, no, please go. I can wait.
Well, the question was whether they were accentuating negative aspects of our society, is the positive aspects of our culture. And there you did say, what you mentioned an accountability partner. And I think it's really important to become familiar with the resources in the community that can help you discern those differences, and, invite community members into the schools that can, absolutely help you discern those differences.
All right. Yes, Theresa.
Oh, I was just going to add, recently in my African-American theater class, a student had mentioned when she was in high school, there was a teacher who would have this day where they would have to chase the African-American students. They were talking about the history of the enslavement. It was a very traumatic experience. And as the student was talking about it, I thought about how many times in history books we will see certain things depicted that are not true or just paint the negative portrayal. And so talking to students about how we can do symbolic reversals, how we can do symbolic transformations based on Paul Carter Harrison's work, how we can take that story and have them claim it, and in a way that it does not tear them down, but help build them up from a positive historical perspective. So I was just going to add that. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Okay, and so for a second here, a question popped up in the chat for me to address, and it's very interesting. How do we introduce activities in a relatable way? And Theresa, you just you provided one example, without tokenizing our students. So how do we do this? How do we try to adopt the culture without receiving that criticism in our classroom about making those particular students in your class a token?
Well, I think being sensitive to any student in the classroom is important. I mean, there are other kinds of marginalization that occurs, besides being Black or being female or, being able-bodied. I think that that's the teacher's role, is to, sensitively address whatever they're teaching. I mean, I had an experience in a museum where they had a Civil War display, and the teaching aide, the teaching curriculum asked the question of the students, what would it have been like for you to have had your town invaded or disrupted by, soldiers rambling through it? And I was like, that's a real one perspective kind of question. I mean, and so taking an African-American student here to try to ponder, well, what would I have felt like as a 1700 kid in a town with a vested interest in its survival, having those kinds of, that kind of clarity about what you're teaching, having centering the identity of your students. Sometimes, so often we are an afterthought, we're a footnote. But centering the identity, means that you take on those fights. When I was fighting against having the names of schools reflect white supremacy, it was just unconscionable to me that so many white teachers, who were the majority of our administrators and teachers in the school district, were oblivious to it. How can you say you care about the kids? You're ferreting out bias supposedly in testing, but then you're letting them learn under the banner of a Confederate general, and for not caring. I just think that you have to center the identity of all of the students you teach.
So Gregg, this is a great segue into this next question. And I'm not taking these questions in order. I'm trying to allow them to flow with the conversation. So stick around, nobody leave. Your question is not being unheard, but I'm flowing. So someone says here, I'm a public school teacher and was deeply influenced by the no excuses school reform. So how do teachers balance educational accountability that is required and expected from the system with a variety of social emotional learning of students?
Can you repeat the last part of that question?
Absolutely. How do teachers balance the accountability or the expectations, like no school, no excuses,
Yes.
with the social or emotional experience? So with everything that we listened to in this video, how do they balance that? Mm-hmm.
So I think it goes back to where I was saying about validate, because in one part of the video, they talked about Black girls are all automatically seen as suspect. And when you automatically see someone as suspect, anything that comes out of their mouth is an excuse. And so when you don't know where they come from, and when you don't have an idea of what they go through to get to the school today, their stories is not an excuse. It is who they are. And so you have to give them that voice and give them that opportunity and give them, because when we get into that no excuses, we stop listening. And when you stop listening, it's telling them that. And I love the end of this documentary when we say, Black girl, you are sacred in love. And when we stop listening, we take away them being sacred and loved. You have to hear their stories. So as a public school teacher, and I put myself in that category, you have to listen to them. And not always, you can look at the philosophy of the no excuses, but part of no excuses is holding somebody accountable. And when you hold them accountable, you show them the alternatives and you teach them the alternatives. So that's what you do as a public school teacher.
So Tiffany, this is also leading into another question, and I know Terence is going to have something with this. I'm just excited to hear this. I'm ready. But so if you say there are no excuses and you hold someone accountable, and perhaps it's aligning with what Tiffany is saying about, how you hear someone, then this makes me think about criminalization as a whole and how this happens over time. And so in the chat, there was in the question answer section here, there was a question: Black girls get in trouble for insubordination. Just as Isabel Wilkerson explains, Black people have been kept in their places and punished for insubordination since Africans were first kidnapped and enslaved in this continent. She asked to comment on this and explain how that leads to criminalization of our children. And I responded really quickly by saying that human capital transmission is the exchange of this idea that someone has or is without power or value or use, or they can't contribute much in society. And so when somebody hears someone's words or emotions and they look at them as being universally insubordinate, then that means that the response is to punish, as opposed to thinking of them kindly and to rehabilitate or to provide support. And so I know Terence has something to say about this type of conflict that then potentially leads to criminalization.
Yeah, I mean, and you saw it in the film too. People talking about the school to prison pipeline, and this is something that I think there's not been enough attention given to how this affects Black girls specifically, which is great that this film is focusing on these issues. Because 30% of incarcerated women in this country are Black, even though it's like 13% of the country is Black women. So it's like a huge disproportionate representation in prisons. And I do work inside San Quentin with folks. And I hear over and over again stories where people can look back to their childhood, look back to a specific incident in school and say, if I'd had a different support system then, my life would have been different. I have no doubt I would not be incarcerated in here right now. And so, the idea that we are criminalized from school, from education, and not given the kind of resources needed. It's this vicious cycle, and it replicates itself all throughout our lives in different ways. The other thing I wanted to touch on was sort of the accountability idea as well, and how we need to rethink what accountability means, especially when it comes to Black girls and how they've been treated. And how do we hold people accountable and still hold them, in community? And by rethinking that, by thinking about, even things of what are school budgets spent on? How much of that goes to police in schools instead of arts and theater? I think it was great to see in the film how performing and how artistic expression really changed the life of some of the girls in the film. Why don't we put more money towards that instead of security guards with guns and badges who are brutalizing Black girls in school?
Thank you so much. Those were great examples that we have to follow. I hope you all are writing these things down. Of course, this is going to be recorded, so you all can listen to it over and over and over again, which you may want to. So the next series of questions, they align with pop culture, positive or negative perspectives, and also uplifting or empowering, genres of activities to engage students with. But I'm messing around with this in my head, and I'm thinking about pointing fingers and blaming, versus accountability here. And so I want us to talk a little bit about, yeah, what do we think pop culture has done, but also what is our personal responsibility, even though we see things happening within our genres of music and activity that we have for entertainment and so on and so forth. What do you all think about that?
Yeah, it's a, you know, it's kind of a continuation of Black women have no protection. Unfortunately, you know, we've never been the damsel in distress, and I think we often laugh at damsels in distress. We're like, we were never allowed to be damsels in distress, you know, from, you know, our great grandmothers, those of us who had, you know, have had that, you know, lineage, you know, throughout the diaspora, we've all had that. And so it's, you know, it's been, you know, kind of orchestrated with our, you know, our incarceration rates of our African-American men, and our women have mothers having, you know, to raise our children alone, and the pressures that, you know, ensue with us. So, you know, our pop culture, you know, I think there has to be a reckoning with our, you know, our men in that culture, you know, of the way that they, you know, they refer to women. That's just another layer of, you know, abuse.
You know, Dr. Gregg, I wanted to add to that when you talked about the protection and the incarceration rates of the Black men, and we forget that our girls are not being protected, and they're not being seen as, they can't even be seen as little girls. They don't get the girlhood experience. You know, they're done playing with dolls at about 4 or 5, because now I have to take on the woman role. And so, you know, they don't get to be little girls. They don't get to see what it's like to be a daddy's little girl, and to have your daddy sitting on the porch with a shotgun, daring somebody to come and touch his little girl. So they're being exposed. You know, it's just like being out in the winter, in the cold without a winter coat. They don't have that, and they're trying to fend for themselves in a life where, and they see other girls from other cultures, and they have their daddies, and they have that protection.
Yeah, and that gives you a
Yes, I think it's also so important that we are helping our young people to understand the stereotypes that are continually perpetuated when we think about, particularly with young Black girls, this idea of the hypersexualized Jezebel image, but as well as the sapphire image that Black women are loud and boisterous. And also thinking about, even as children in the 20th century, this notion of children being the pickaninnies or animalistic. And so that in society, we are treated along the lines of these stereotypes. So helping them to see that this is an image that is being reflected on me, this is not who I am, and then empowering them to say, this is my story, really listening to them and asking them, how do you see yourself? How do you want others to see you? Because society is so quick to put these images on us, particularly as Black girls and Black women. I loved it, and if you haven't had a chance to see Monique Morris's TED Talk, where she talks about, yes, this idea of what we can do to change the system. And she says, we are freedom fighters. And I believe one of the things that all of us have to do is help our young girls free themselves from the oppressive ideas that are being funneled and channeled towards them.
And I think to go off,
sorry.
That's okay. Just going off what Theresa just said too, I think we also got to look at whose stories are being told, and you know, whose stories are out there. I mean, as a playwright working in American theater, it's really disheartening to see the lack of plays produced by Black women playwrighs. I think 6% was something that I saw of all American plays produced over the last couple of years were by women of color. And so that's an even smaller percentage when you think about how many Black women playwrights had their stories out, and none of that can be addressed if our stories are not being told, and Black girls are not seeing them reflected on stage, in TV, film. These are things that, barriers that start in the school, as we see, and continue on right up until Broadway, these kinds of things.
Terence
And I
and
also think
Theresa, really quickly, Dr. Gregg, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna ask him this question and then we can carry on. But there was a question, what are some names of some empowering plays that may be great for Black and Brown students? So just to go on with what you're saying, someone asked that question really quickly. What are some examples of some empowering plays? Do you know?
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't have kids, so the plays I would recommend may not be suitable for students.
How about August Wilson? Anything by August Wilson?
Yeah.
Anything. Two Trains Running, Fences. Maybe not Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, but they've all been done.
Yeah.
They've all been produced on Netflix by now.
Blues for Mr. Charlie.
And Tazaki Shangate plays, which are for colored girls.
And Rachel.
So maybe you can type a couple in the chat as we continue our dialogue. Maybe we can type a couple in the chat that people may be able to explore, some of them that we mentioned, for those who are interested in incorporating empowering plays that will help our Black and Brown students become really excited about that.
I just thought of one. By Kia Cortland too. It's really good. I'll find it and put it in the chat.
But I was going to say that, I'm really focused on trying to empower mothers. I mean, we're leaving mothers out of this empowerment thing. I mean, and when you do that, you reinforce this chasm between the girls in their environments at school and what they go home to. And I think that mothers need to be able to reinforce things that they may have not learned themselves, just so that there is a continuum. Just so I think that so many young people, young girls of various backgrounds, if they're economically poor, like in West Virginia, where I taught in Campbell's Creek, and those girls as well have a disconnect from their mamas who don't speak English well. Who say Kathleen instead of Kathleen, and then the teacher corrects them, and then they have this acrimony between mom and daughter. And I think the same kind of things happen with when we leave out empowering the mothers as well.
Dr. Gregg, and I want to add to that because I was thinking about that when you said building community and relationship and going into the community. And if you know some of the mothers and if you work with some of the children in the office and then their moms come in and you be like, okay. So one of the initiatives that I saw that was beneficial is I started working with the mothers on when you come to advocate for your child, because every parent, that's the role of the parent, is to advocate for their child. This is how you advocate for your child. And you model that, and I had parents call me and say, Miss Burris, so should I say it like this or should I say it like that? And having that relationship, and I tell my teachers all the time, it's better to have a relationship with the parent, because when you call them, you get to play offense and not defense. And that because I have called a parent and we had ended up being on first name basis. And I called and I said, Nikisha. And she said, are y'all taking a test today? Because she knew that her daughter was shut down. We knew her daughter was shut down because she had test anxiety. And just having those type of relationships, or when a parent would come in and talk to them, they said, did I do this right? They need to feel that support from the people in the schools, because then they know that you care about their children as well.
Support and acceptance. Yeah.
Tiffany, there's another question. Dr. Gregg, Tiffany, there's another question that came in, and I know you both will tackle this question with care, especially Dr. Gregg. So, how do we deal with children who no longer trust? Students who've been betrayed and they're subliminally screaming for help.
Mm.
What do we do? I know you guys.
There's so many.
You-
There's
you-
so many restorative practices.
Yes.
That no excuses thing and making kids accountable doesn't mean that you punish them. They need to be accountable and to understand the rationale that they use to exhibit the behavior that may not be appropriate for certain environments.
And you have to find one adult in the building that the student can trust. When we've written behavior intervention plans and you can't put the name of a person, step one is send student to assistant principal so they can de-escalate, because that's the person that they trust. Have assistant principal meet student at the white bench, and people say, what's the white bench? But it was a bench in the hallway that they could sit down and calm down and be able to de-escalate. And having just one person send student to security officer because they had a relationship. Even our custodians was a trustworthy, for some students, they only wanted to speak to the custodian. But if it was that person in that building that they trust, you had to give them access to the one adult that they can trust in the building. And then you wrap around and start to rally, and then they begin to trust more students. But you have to find that one person in the building and let that student have access.
So I'm thinking, why don't they trust anybody? So all the things that we're talking about too, I thought to myself, like, okay, throughout this film, we saw stereotypes where there was limited empathy, or these rules and regulations that existed that were not in support of these girls, or a lack of opportunity or access to do certain things that other people had been able to do, or dysfunctional networks that aren't created or established. Like, are we creating networks for these children? Are we aligning them with people who they can trust? Are we giving them a reason, perhaps, to trust somebody? So I thought about that too. Not only, what do we do with these kids that don't trust? Well, why not? Why don't they trust anybody? What's happened here? Is there a bigger story? Is there something else? Have you asked them why they don't trust anybody? So I thought about that too.
Yeah.
And I see here also, like, not necessarily to call it a blame game, but a lot of the questions are being framed like, how do we do something with these students? Or, what do we do with this student with this particular problem? And I think a good thing to do is to kind of reverse it, to ask, why does this problem exist and what role do I play in that problem? So am I part of the problem? I think those are good things to ask, as well as we find these different support processes and mechanisms that we use.
I was going to say, when you say why, then you start to dig into understanding that there needs to be a shift in the mindset. What's the mindset? What's the culture of the school? What's the culture of the district? And so that's when you have to start. Why do we have so many children who do not trust the adults who are supposed to serve and nurture them? Then you have to begin to look at the mindset.
What are we allowing to happen? Yes, Theresa.
Yes, I was going to say, I would agree. And also, many of these organizations are built on foundations of fear versus love. And we kept hearing this notion in terms of love and support. And we need to be able to love these children. And I believe that trust is a child of love. And so if you are not, and the child can sense that you don't love them, so they're not going to trust you if you are not willing to meet them where they are, to really take a genuine interest in them and to really love them, as the beautiful humans that they are. So I really do think it is taking a look at the environment and say, are we supporting a culture of fear or a culture of love?
So everyone, I'm thinking that we have ended on this amazing note of love, and we've talked about race and ethnicity and political correctness and this idea of empowering empowering people and not separating or dividing, and this interesting piece of doing something with the parent or the mother and understanding that this child is not alone and that we need to be involved in the community and thinking critically about how we actively engage both the student and the community, whether it is their feelings or their needs or just creating a space for them. We can create that space through theater and arts and all of the wonderful examples that are in the chat here that you may think of or consider, but we can also do that by identifying an accountability partner or someone who can help us walk through or talk through this journey. We can do it by taking an implicit bias test to kind of think critically about some of the things where we need to look inside instead of, looking outward. How can we address these challenges if we aren't looking at and exploring ourselves? How do we know how to create a space or a bond for children if we are not sure what our challenges are in approaching this? We talked about identity, we talked about criminalization processes, which some of those things align and connect with how we decide to interpret and understand these beautiful young Black girls who may have a number of different things going on. Our panelist, playwright Terence Anthony, was amazing for us and provided some amazing insight. Tiffany Burris came and brought our education advocacy to us, and Theresa Davis talked about theater. She talked about passion. She talked about love. She talked about ways that we can center our culture and make those things of value. And Dr. Gregg, Suzanne Ferguson, introduced so much to us, from family to perspectives about trust and understanding our communities and really trying to make a change, one that is impactful. So I thank all of the panelists today for their wonderful insight on this film. And I thank everybody for listening. I'm going to pass this over to our team now to speak with you about the closing of the event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. Thank you, Dr. Howard Bostic, for moderating, and thank you to all of our panelists for such wonderful insights on how we can handle this problem. I know as a mother, I'm thinking of where I can step in and how I can play a role in intervening when necessary. So thank you for both aspects, from parenting and administrators. Again, we would like to thank working with Carla Hunter and Erica Logan of the Delta Sigma Theta Eastern Panhandle Alumnae chapter. We are so thankful that you all have chosen to work with us and are continuing this partnership, that we look forward to doing more events like this. And also, we would like to thank our partner, the West Virginia Humanities Council, who helped to sponsor and part this event today. So again, thank you all for being here with us. If you are looking for to take more action and to learn more, as was shared in the chat, you can go to the Pushout website, which is pushoutfilm.com, and there's more information there that can be shared with you and resources to become involved. So again, thank you all for being with us tonight, and we should see you soon. And Erica?
Yes, wow, what an important and impactful documentary and an enriching and thought-provoking discussion. My name is Erica Logan. I'm the president of the Eastern Panhandle Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority. And on behalf of the chapter, I too want to thank all of the panelists, also the Contemporary American Theater Festival for partnering with us. And I just want to thank also the community, everyone who hung in there with us for this wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. If we learn nothing else, we know that our Black girls are to be supported, they are sacred, and they are loved. And I hope you will continue this dialogue and the education you got tonight with your peers and your colleagues, and continue your education on this topic. So thank you very much.